Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about social authentication in Oracle Apex. My name is Mark Seefts. I'm the development manager for Apex. I have Christian Neumüller with me. He's responsible for security in Apex and many other things. And he'll be helping me answer your questions. And he also did all the legwork of figuring out all the different details for configuring things like Facebook, Google, and so on. He also developed the social sign-in feature in Apex 18.1, and we talk more about that in a moment. Here's our safe harbor statement. Most of what I'm going to show you today, what I'm going to talk about is based or is working in Apex 18.1 and Apex 18.2. There are a few things that are specific to Apex 19.1, which has not been released yet. So that's why our safe harbor statement applies. I do want to point out a few things. ApexEA.oracle.com is online, is available. It's been available since early February. If you had a chance to try it out and provided feedback, thank you very much. If you just want to take it for a spin, please go to ApexEA.oracle.com and try it out. I'm going to use ApexEA.oracle.com today for my demonstration, mainly because ApexEA.oracle.com runs on a 18.3 Oracle database, which is necessary for some of the social networks that I'm interfacing with. For example, Facebook currently doesn't work on apex.oracle.com, our main public site, because we're using an older database there, 12.1. But as you can see on Slack, there was already a question about apex.oracle.com or an announcement. It's going to be upgraded to the 18.3 database tomorrow night, starting tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Pacific. So once that has been upgraded, all my examples should be working on apex.oracle.com as well. That's not yet the upgrade to Apex 19.1. That's at a later date. So tomorrow night, that's only going to be the upgrade to the 18.3 database. I also want to point out our updated statement of direction. We keep this always up to date. It talks about the features being introduced with Apex 19.1, as well as what we have planned for Apex 19.2, our next release, or the next release after 19.1. Also want to give a quick shout out to some of the Apex community members who've been writing about social login and social sign-in. Niels de Bruyn from the MTAG wrote a paper on single sign-on with Apex apps using OAuth 2, which I found very helpful to understand the whole flow better. Also, Dimitri Gilos from Apex R&D and Adrian Ping from Insum wrote blog posts on interfacing with Facebook and Google. They're also very helpful because even though the feature itself in Apex is pretty straightforward, the difficult parts are how to figure out all the different attributes and scope and all the other settings that are specific to, say, Facebook or Google or LinkedIn or Okta or whatever you want to use. So it's very valuable to have these resources available to read up on this. Right, so here's what I want to cover. I'm going to start out with authentication Apex, just a few general words on what that actually is and how it works. Then I want to talk about OAuth 2, how that works, the typical OAuth 2 flow, what it's used for, and what you can do with it in Apex. And then I want to take a look at some specific social networks that allow OAuth 2-based authentication for your own applications, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn. There are many more. There's Okta, there's Azure, there's all kinds of providers. And depending on what kind of application you're building, some may make more sense than others. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn certainly make more sense if you're building social apps out on the web. If you're building a more business-like application, maybe Azure or Okta are more relevant choices. And at the very end, I want to talk briefly about authorization in Apex because I think it's an important topic to cover in this context. I occasionally run into customers who think their applications are secure once they have authentication enabled, be it Apex authentication or social or LDAP or single sign-on or whatever. But that really only gets your users into the door, right? Once they're authenticated, they can do whatever they want to in the application. And if you are using Google or Facebook, then you're opening up your application to billions of potential users. So authorization is where you actually define which users get in and what they can do. Are they read-only users? Are they admins? Are they contributors? So those kind of settings are done through authorization. So it's important to understand how that plays in with authentication. All right, let's start with authentication first. So authentication at a very basic level means your users identify who they are when they access your applications. Typically, they enter a password and a username, and then they get in. Now, when you're building an application, you have to choose what kind of authentication you want to use. You can choose to not require any authentication at all, meaning it's a public website, public application. You can use one of our built-in authentication schemes. We have a gallery of authentication schemes that we pre-built for you. I'm going to go through some of the options shortly. But you can also create your own custom authentication schemes. So if the options that we provide are not what you need, you can use PL/SQL and interface with whatever authentication provider you want to use and build your own authentication scheme around that. Now, the gallery or the pre-built configuration authentication schemes that we provide include Apex accounts, right? Application Express accounts. That's our default setting. So you manage your users inside Apex. You differentiate between end users, developers, and admins, but you essentially do your user management inside Apex, and everybody who has an Apex account in your workspace can access your applications. Then, of course, there's custom authentication, which I just talked about. You can choose to use database accounts. You can use some external authentication method and use HTTP header variables to submit usernames. You can interface with LDAP. And then you can choose to not use authentication using the database access descriptor, or you can use open door credentials, which makes sense while you're testing your application. You can just type in your name and you get in. Then there's Oracle single sign-on. And then starting with Apex 18.1, there's social sign-in, which allows you to use things like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, or other OAuth2 or OpenID providers. All right. I want to cover deep linking just briefly because I think it's relevant in this context. Deep linking means that you can link into any page, subpage, child page inside your application and just be prompted to authenticate and then be taken to that specific page rather than being taken to the homepage all the time. And the reason I'm thinking it's relevant for this topic is because if you can put your links up on Facebook or Twitter or elsewhere that open up specific resources like a specific product or category in your application, you want to have your users authenticate with whatever, Facebook, Google, and then be redirected directly to that resource without having to go to the homepage. So you can manage deep linking in the application, your application security attributes, just enable session management in deep linking session management in those attributes. Now, one interesting thing about social authentication, of course, is that you may want to allow your users to use their choice of authentication, right? You don't just want to use Google or Facebook. Maybe you want to provide them with a choice. They can use the Apex authentication if they have an account, or they can choose to use Google or Facebook or LinkedIn in my example. And the way to do that is that you enable multiple authentication schemes for your Apex application. That's something that's been introduced recently. What you have to do is you go to enable switch in session for your authentication scheme. And once that is enabled, you can use a request like this, Apex authentication equals scheme name like Facebook or Google in your application. So what I've done in my example, which I'm going to show you, I put requests behind these buttons. Those buttons just take you back to the home page, right? They don't do anything else. They just take you to page 1 of your application. But they also submit this request, Apex authentication equals scheme name. And in doing so, they change your authentication scheme at runtime, and you are taken to one of these providers. All right, so a few points on social login. Social login supports all kinds of OpenID and OAuth 2 standards. Built into Apex, we have Google and Facebook. That means that you have to provide less information. I also have an example included for LinkedIn. LinkedIn is not one of the natively built-in ones, which means you have to do a lot of more research to figure out what are the exact URLs to kind of do all the redirection. So Google and Facebook are pretty straightforward and easy to configure. Other OAuth 2 provider require you to gather more information on how they work and what kind of information they require. Social login for your Apex applications was introduced with Apex 18.1. And in Apex 19.1, we are extending this to also support builder access. So if you want to log into the Apex IDE, you can configure your Apex instance to also use social login. Now, when you use social login, then you need to provide web credentials like the client secret and ID that your provider gives you. That information is not stored in your application. It's stored at the workspace level. So when you use social login in your application and you export your application, that information is not carried along, which makes sense, right? You don't want to have this secret information be part of your plain text application export. And then when you install your application into, say, your production instance, then during the installation, you will be prompted to provide this client ID and client secret, which may be different from your development instance, right? Because when you configure OAuth 2 with, say, Google, you define what is the callback URL to your application, which will be different on a development and production instance. That will make more sense in a moment once I talk about how to configure this. All right, so that's authentication in very basic terms, how it works in Apex. Now let's talk about OAuth 2, and oops, let me actually go here. Let's talk about OAuth network accounts and limited access, get some information like your email address, maybe a picture, maybe your real name. And with OAuth 2, you basically authorize your users to kind of, well, the users will be authorized to kind of retrieve that information. The way it works, whoops, sorry, that was too quick. And I don't want to show this. All right, so the way it works, it is delegating the authentication step to the service provider, right? Rather than having an Apex login screen, you're being taken to a Google or Facebook login screen, and then you're being taken back to your application with some information that authorizes you inside Apex. And OAuth 2 is a framework that provides authorization flows for different types of use cases and applications. What we are going to focus on are web applications, right? Apex runs on the web. It's a web application, but if you develop desktop apps or if you develop mobile apps, native mobile apps, that flow may be a little bit different. So we're going to focus just on the authorization flow for web apps. A link to the privacy policy and terms of use and all kinds of additional information. And then once you have it all set up, you get a client ID and client secret, which you take back into Apex to define your web credentials. So let's take a look at an OAuth 2 flow in more general terms. On the left-hand side, I have my application, Apex application, any kind of web application. On the right-hand side, I have Facebook in this case. I'm talking to an authorization server and a resource server. The authorization server is what authorizes me, which kind of takes care of me logging in and providing access to certain resources. And then the resource server is what actually provides things like the username, the email, the picture, or whatever else you might request. So as you log into your web application, the first thing that happens is that that request is sent over to Facebook. Facebook serves you up with a login page. You type in your username and password. You are authenticated. And if that was successful, then an authorization grant is sent back to your Apex application along with an authorization code. So the next step is to actually send this back, the authorization code, along with the client ID and secret that you stored on the Apex side, which then in return identifies you and your request and your authorization request on the Facebook site. And Facebook sends you back an access token. Now, once you have that access token, you're ready to actually retrieve the information that you need, right? Which is username, email, photo, whatever. So you send that access token over to the resource server, and the resource server then looks up that information and sends it back, sends that protected resource back to your Apex application, things like name, email, photo, and so on. So that's a very basic flow. All of this is automatically taken care of for you by Apex once you configure things, but just to kind of outline what happens as you authenticate, this is a very basic OAuth 2 flow. Now, to translate that into more Apex-specific terms, let's go through all the different pieces in that puzzle. So first thing, you register your Apex application with your OAuth provider, and then the provider creates that client ID and client secret for you. You take that information and you store it as web credentials in Apex at the workspace level, right? This is what we talked about earlier. It's not something that you store in your authentication scheme inside your app. It's at the workspace level, and it's more or less specific to your instance. If it's a dev instance, it may be different from a prod instance. Next, your end user goes to whatever application they want to run, apex.oracle.com. That's just a demo app. I don't know if it's a real thing. I just typed in once. And then once you are there, Apex creates a session for you. And initially, you're going to be nobody, right? You're going to have a session, but you are not authenticated yet. So Apex is going to check if the page that you're requesting, like the homepage, requires authentication. If it doesn't, it's a public page and you get just to see the page. If it does require authentication, you're being redirected to the login screen of your OAuth 2 provider, Facebook or Google or whatever. And then you are taken over there, you authenticate, and you're being taken back to Apex using the callback URL you stored in your provider app definition. So you log in, I'm skipping a few steps here, sorry. So you're logging in with a username and password, and sometimes, depending on what kind of resource you're requesting, you're also going to be prompted to give consent to resources like your email address or your photo. And then you're being sent back to your callback URL, which is this one here. So depending on where you're running things, that URL will look different. In this case, I'm running it on apexea.oracle.com. If it's your own instance, then that might be apexoracle.com or whatever is your own domain and instance URL. So let's say you're successfully authenticated, you're taken back to this URL, and then Apex does the additional steps that we talked about earlier. It requests that token from your provider, sending over the client ID and client secret, and then stores that token inside Apex. Next step, we're looking at the scope attribute. The scope defines what information you want to retrieve, username, email, photo, and then you can retrieve that information back from that resource server, and we store that information in a JSON document inside Apex, and you actually have access to that document through the Apex JSON.g values. Right, so now you have your token and you're authenticated, you have your own Apex session with your own username, and you're taken to the original requested page, which typically is the home page. All right, once that is all said and done, all your other requests like navigating to other pages, using your application, looking at reports, running charts or whatever, that's just local inside Apex. So you have your session cookie, you have an established session. So as long as that session is alive, you're not going to go back to your authentication provider. You have that session running. All right, so now let's have everybody kind of play along a little bit. I created this application here. So you can go there using, not again. You can go there using your web browser. this out of the way. bit.ly/apex_social_login. And when you go there, you get to my sample application. And what I created here is just a very simple Apex app with a standard Apex authentication login screen. I have an Apex account here. You don't, so you can choose to use social login if you want to try out this application. You can use Google, you can use LinkedIn. If you're using Facebook, you'll be prompted or you'll be warned that this is not a live application. So on the Facebook side of things, you need to go through some review and approval process. So right now, I'm the only one who can use my Facebook account with this application, but you should be able to get in there with your Google account. So let's take a look at that. You push Google, and then you're being taken to the Google sign-in screen. If you have multiple accounts configured, you're being prompted which one you want to use. I'm going to go with this one here. I'm going to type in my password. I'm going to hit next. And I should remember my password. Oh, come on. Oh, sorry. I mixed up my Google accounts. Here you go. So now Apex called, well, the provider sends me back to the callback URL. I get authenticated, and I'm in my Apex app now. This is my home screen. Again, if you want to try this out, I have the URL copied up here, bit.ly Apex social login. And I can actually look at the information that was retrieved by Apex from my authentication provider, in this case, Google. So you get your picture URL, and you get your email, and you get these tokens down here. If you do this with an account that actually has a picture stored, let's try this again. Go to Google. Yeah. I need to log out of Google first. So I'm going to sign out. I'm going to go back to Google. And now I'm going to use my Gmail account. Works better. So now I'm authenticating with this different Google account. And in this case, I actually have my picture stored. So I'm actually retrieving back the picture from Google. All right, so that's very basic how the flow looks and works. I'm going to get into the details of how to configure this shortly. But let's first talk about setting up an app on the Google site. So if you want to use Google authentication, the first thing you need to do is create a project. And you create a project at this URL, consoledevelopersgoogle.com. So I'm going to go there. And I'm already logged in as myself. So once you're in this console, you'll find this drop-down up here. And in there, you can define your projects. I have a few defined from previous demos. You can also go in and create a new project and then provide information like your project name and information of your application and URLs. Once you have it all set up, what you'll end up with is credentials. And here under the Credentials tab, you have an OAuth consent screen. This is what is shown to users as they log in. Right, there's the application name, there's an application icon, there's a support email, there's the scope, the information that you want to request, email profile, OpenID. There's an application homepage link, there's a policy link, and a terms of service link. So all this information is set up, and then you can go to the credentials to retrieve your client ID. When you click on this, you can retrieve your client secret, which, as the name says, is secret. So I'm not going to go there right now. I do have a screenshot though. This is how that would look like. So on this client ID page, you get your client ID and client secret, which I grayed out. You have your application name. And further down here, important, you have your authorization redirect URL. That's the URL that Google, in this case, takes you back to once you're authenticated. Once you have all of this set up, you go back to Apex and you go to the web credentials inside Apex. Let me show you that. So you go to Apex, log in. All right, that's just going to take 20 minutes or so. That's better. Okay, so now I'm logged in. I'm going into my workspace, and I go into the application builder. And then where you want to go is workspace utilities. And then in workspace utilities, you go to web credentials. And in here, you define your credentials. So I have a number defined, Facebook, LinkedIn. I copied a bunch that Christian had shown me that he has in his application like Okta and Azure. I'm just going to focus on those three here, Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And my Google one looks like this. So in here, I have a static identifier. It's an OAuth2 client credentials flow. I have my client ID, and I supply my client secret. And that's about it. So once I have this defined, I can now go ahead and very easily build an Apex application. Just create a very basic one. The demo, just a home page, that should be enough. I'm going to create the app. And then by default, of course, it gets created with Apex authentication. But I want to switch this, so I'm going to go to Shared Components, Authentication Schemes. I'm going to create Google. I'm going to start with a pre-configured scheme from the gallery. I'm going to call this Google. Scheme type is going to be social sign-in. And in this case, I want to use the pre-created Google authentication scheme. This is Google. And the point here is that Google and Facebook are already pre-configured. If you pick a generic OAuth2 provider, there's a lot more information for you to provide. So let's just go with the easy one, Google. And now I need to look up what I actually used there. So let me do that over another screen. You're not seeing what I'm looking up right now. Well, I can actually bring this up. So here you go. I'm just using a different browser to copy and paste this information. So I do have this application that I've shown you in the beginning of my demo. And in here I have a Google authentication scheme defined. And I essentially want to copy this information over to my new one. So what I'm after is the username attribute, email, that's correct, and the additional attributes. That's really all I need at this point. I'm going to create authentication scheme. I'm going to hit run. And now, rather than being taken to, all right.
Mark, I think you missed the scope.
Pardon?
Mark, I think you missed the scope and the authentication scheme parameters. There was email also in the scope, I think.
Oh, right. Good catch. Thanks. Well, scope, profile, and email. Oh, yeah, you're right. Excellent find. Let's try it again. All right. Could have worked, didn't work. That's how you set it up. I do have it running in this one here. So you've seen that before. So there Google worked. And to show you how the finished authentication scheme looks like, you do have the name, you have the scheme type, social sign-in, you have the credential store, what I set up on the workspace level, you have the authentication provider, profile email for the scope, and then I have this post-authentication procedure here, which is what gets me all the image information and email information. And I'm running this post-authentication, after post-authentication. So that's how you set things up with Google. And one interesting thing, when you look at the shared components, I also created this application process. And this application process runs after authentication. And what I'm doing here is I'm capturing your username and authentication scheme, and I'm storing it in a history log. So I can actually look at all the people who are connected. And I created this view that is a little bit masked, so it's not like quite open to read. And I can look at everybody who kind of logged in. So those are the logins over the last couple of minutes. Let's look at a few more. So thanks everybody for participating. All right, so looks like you're all busy trying out the app. That's awesome, 24 so far. So again, the login is bit.ly Apex Social Login. Everybody's welcome to try it out. And one of the benefits of using social login, as you can see, is that you can capture that information as users log in. All right, now let's take a quick look at how this works with Facebook. Facebook, if you want to configure this in Facebook, it's not called a project, it's called an app. And you go to developers.facebook.com/apps. Let's do that. And then you connect. All right, so I already have an app. I can add a new app if I like. So if I want to set it up from scratch, same flow essentially. You provide a display name, you provide information about your application, and then you set something up that looks like this. So in here you have the application details, you have some analytics going, you have an app ID, which is what you need in your web credentials. You have some additional settings relevant to your application, like what's the privacy URL, what's the application icon, what's your email, what's the domain, and some additional information about your address. And then the important piece is the Facebook login. That's where you define things like your callback URL down here, as well as some of the other settings. So this is where I struggled a bit to find the exact right settings for use with Apex. So I'll share my application later on once it runs on apexorg.com. I'll share the app. You can take a look at it. But this is where it kind of was a little bit tricky to configure. And then also want to go to advanced, because I think that's where you, nope, that's not. Where's my client secret? Oh, here. So there's your app ID. This is information that you need for your web credentials, as well as your app secret. So you can show it and then copy and paste it over to your web credentials. So at this point, I'm ready to go back to Apex. So we looked at this page, we looked at the basic settings, your app ID and secret, and we set up the callback URL. And now we're ready to go back to web credentials in Apex. So going back to Apex, going back to Workspace Utilities, going to web credentials, I can now go ahead and either create new credentials or take a look at what I've already created beforehand. My Facebook credentials, so just like before, there's a name, there's a static identifier, there's an authentication type, a client ID, and then not shown here are the client secret or password. And once you have that, same deal as before, you create your application, use an existing application, and you hook up a new authentication scheme. In this case, of course, I already created it. So going back to authentication schemes, this time we're looking at Facebook. And here we have scheme type social login, the link to the credential store, Facebook in this case, the authentication provider, and then somewhat different profile and username and additional attributes. In this case, I need to use name, which I had email in there before, which didn't work, so slightly different settings based on the provider. And then just like before, the post-authentication procedure, which stores some of the information that I get from my provider. So let's try this out. Going back to the login page. Going back to the login page, using Facebook. And now I'm already signed into Facebook because I've shown you this, right? that already authenticated me. So Apex automatically picked that up. I'm Mark Seefts, and when I look at my user info, I see my picture, I see my Facebook email. So that's the information that I'm retrieving from Facebook. And then when I go back and run my log, I kick myself out. Okay, never mind. So in this log, I would now see Facebook versus Google. Also, if you do sign up with Facebook, the first time you do that, you'll be prompted to provide consent to share that information, and you manage this through your privacy settings, your apps and websites in your profile, where you can actually go in, and if you don't like my Apex app anymore, you can actually remove this. Just select it, remove everything that was posted, and then that's done. I'm going to log out. And now when I try this again, clearly too many passwords. So now comes this screen because I deleted this app from my profile. Now I need to provide consent to share my profile picture and email address. And then I'm going to be taken back here and this information gets loaded again. So that's Facebook. And then last one on my list is LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is interesting because it's not a built-in one, so you need to gather quite a bit more information. So the place where you go to manage this, to manage your app in LinkedIn is this one. And you connect. Well, I guess I've been trying this too much. Let me just do a quick check if I retrieved an email. I did. All right, so there's my demo. Again, if you do this from scratch, you click here on Create App. You go through a similar wizard, providing your app name, URL, and callback URL and such. And once you have that set up, this is what it looks like. You have your client ID here. You have the privacy URL that I entered before. You have your application logo. And then when you click here on this Auth tab, you get information about the client ID and client secret. This is information that you need to provide back to Apex when you create the web credentials. And then further down here, you'll find the OAuth callback URL. So very similar, a little bit different. And when you look at things in Apex, I'm going back to too many open windows. Going back to the builder, going back to workspace utilities, going back to web credentials, and looking at LinkedIn. So in the case of LinkedIn, my static identifier, OAuth to credentials flow, OAuth scope, client ID, client password. I put some comments in here. And once you have that all set up, you're ready to hook this up in your application. So you create a new app, use an existing app, go to the app, go to share components, go to authentication schemes, and then create a new authentication scheme pointing to this LinkedIn web credentials. And in here, again, as before, social sign-in, credential stores, LinkedIn, authentication providers, generic OAuth 2 provider in this case. So it's not Google or Facebook, it's generic OAuth 2. And that means you have to provide all this additional information, the endpoint for authorization, the token endpoint, the user info endpoint, and the scope, which looks a little bit more cryptic, a different kind of username attribute, different kinds of additional attributes down here. So though big thanks to Christian for figuring all this out, I don't think I would have had the patience to figure out how this URL works, but there you go. I have this working. So when I run the app, logging out, creating a new session, I can go to LinkedIn and let me actually log out here. Let's see if they do this code thing again. All right. So now I use a LinkedIn for authentication. I'm being taken over to LinkedIn. I provide my username and password. And there you go. Now I'm connected with LinkedIn. You see my Oracle email up there. And my user ID, I'm in the Greater New York City area. My formatted name. I guess I don't have a picture there. So that's information that I'm retrieving from LinkedIn. So that's just to recap. We went to this URL to create the app. We defined a new app with application name, logo, description, business email, privacy policy, and terms. We looked up the client ID and secret and provided the redirect URL down here at the bottom of my auth scheme. Then we went back to Apex, created new web credentials, and then we created a new authentication scheme in Apex to use LinkedIn. And this is still the wrong image, and I thought I fixed it. Sorry about that. I'll fix it for my download version. All right, so that's LinkedIn, Facebook, and Google. And just to keep you updated on our logins. So when you look at my log again, let's get a few more. So now we have 37 participants, and down here you'll see LinkedIn popping up and more LinkedIn. There's Facebook, that must have been me. So you see a nice list of people logging in. Right, so now we have all of this running, right? We have an Apex application where you can log in with your choice of authentication. You can either use Apex authentication, or you can use your social login. But one thing that I've done here in this application is that I also installed an authorization scheme and access control. Just to very briefly outline what that means. So when you click Create Application, New Application, you have the option to include access control. And that is very useful because it pre-creates an authorization scheme for you, or multiple. It also creates an access control list and functionality to manage that. And that's important if you want to protect your app from everybody in the world having access. So let's talk about authorization briefly. So what authorization is, it is created alongside your authentication schemes, and it basically extends the security of your application. You can basically create an authorization scheme with any kind of pure SQL logic that makes sense for your use case, and then apply this authorization scheme to anything in your app, your page, your components, your reports, your buttons, your list items. Anything allows you to apply an authorization scheme and protect these specific resources. So for example, if you have a report and a form and an edit link and a save button and all these things, you want to show all of this information for users who have full access, but you don't want to show an edit link or save button for users that only have read-only access, right? So this is where authorization schemes come in. And in addition to authorization schemes, there's what we call access control. That's that feature that I picked in the Create Application Wizard. And when you pick that feature, it creates a lot of things for you. It creates a few pages in your application. It also creates specific roles like an administrator, contributor, and reader. It creates authorization schemes like checking whether you're an admin or contributor or reader rights. It creates a build option, so if you choose not to use access control, you can turn it off. And it creates an application setting access control scope. So all of this is pre-created for you by the Create App Wizard. It's also available through the Create Page Wizards. And it's useful because you can now tie this to your authentication schemes. Right, so looking at what got created, you have this screen here under administration. So when you look at my demo app, when I log in with a user who is an admin, I now have this administration link here, and I have this area over here, and here I can enable or disable access control, and I can manage the list of users, right? Now what happens when by default I set this to no? Any authentication user may access the application. When I set this to no, all you guys would not be able to access my application anymore simply because I only want people who are on my access control list. So I'm going to set this, and if anyone tries to log in now, they would get a nasty error message because only people on this list will now have access. I'm going to change this back, right? So you guys may still want to play with it. Apply changes. Now everybody can get in again, but only these users, demo, Mark, have a reader access or administrator contributor access. So this is how I can manage who is allowed to do what. And when you look at my homepage here, go to movies, I actually see this edit link on this report, right? I can go in and edit all these different movies. I can click on this edit link. I have an apply changes button. I see all this information. I can make modifications. But when I log back out and go back in with, say, my Google account, which hasn't been made an admin or contributor, and go back to movies, I don't see the edit link anymore. And I also don't see the modal dialog. And I couldn't even fake it. I couldn't even manipulate the URL to open up the edit form because the page itself is also controlled through an authorization scheme. So the point here is just enabling authentication, especially social authentication, doesn't really protect your app, right? It kind of opens the door to everybody in the world. If you actually want to control who gets to see what, and if anyone or no one gets in, that's where access control comes in and authorization schemes. So take a look at our Create application wizard. Take a look at what that wizard creates in terms of access control features. And also, if you have an existing application, you can go on Create Page, pick Feature, and you can actually add this access control functionality to your existing applications as well. All right, go back to my slides. All right, so we looked at the demo, and we have about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to open it up for questions that kind of came through the chat, and then maybe Christian and I can answer some of those. David or Christian, are you?
So Mark, I'm going to have Christian ask the most relevant questions that came through on the chat and other issues you'd like to bring up. So Christian, over to you.
All right. So yes, there were a few questions. One of them, Mark, was if you could provide this application for download for demo purposes.
Yes, I'm planning to provide that, and it's kind of useless right now because it's running on Apex EA, and the Facebook login in particular requires a newer database. But once we have this upgrade done of apex.oracle.com, I'll make that application available, then everybody can try it out. Just keep in mind, when you install this application, and let me just briefly show this. When you install this application, you do like your normal import, you pick the app, and then you step to the wizard, and you just pick your ID. And then once you have that installed, or once the installation, this step of the installation is through, there will be a prompt for this information, your client ID and client password. I have this already stored in my workspace, but if you're installing this into a new workspace, you need to go in here and then provide that information based on your own setup at Google or Facebook or LinkedIn. Right.
Okay. Another question was about a person was using Apex 5 and there was also a question about CAS authentication, which I believe is some third-party system that's mainly used with SAML. So we introduced social sign-in in Apex 18.1. You can use it from in 18.1 and newer versions. And for older Apex versions, first of all, I think you should consider upgrading Apex for all kinds of reasons. But maybe you're also using some other single sign-on system like SAML, for example. There are several Apache modules, for example, that you can use and install in your Apache server in front of auths that provides single sign-on and that can pass HTTP headers to Apex. And then you can use header-based authentication in Apex with these systems. And there was also a question about the refresh token. So a person had already tried Google social sign-in, and they were using within the application web requests to display some Google Mail emails or even send them. That's perfectly fine, but it only works for about an hour, because then the access token that we get during login times out. And after this hour, these requests fail. So Google also sends, or in general, OAuth sends a refresh token, and we could in principle use this to get a new access token that hasn't been implemented yet. It's on my list. So maybe in the next or some other Apex version, this will be available. And then there are a few new questions on the chat. Let's see, a new sample app for social sign-in. I think Mark explained that. There's a new standard WebAuthn, and there was a question if we have plans to support that. I haven't looked at it in detail yet. If it gets wide use, I'm pretty sure that we will try to implement that if it's possible, because we have some limitations in Apex and in PL SQL. But if it's possible, of course, we'll try to support that. Then there's another question, if it's possible to display the whole JSON object that's returned. So I think there's no easy implementation for that yet. You could use the Apex JSON write object procedure in combination with the Apex JSON G values variable, and write that to a CLOP and then store the CLOP somewhere. For example, write it to the debug or something like that. Yeah, that's about it. And then Adrian mentions that Niels and he have Semver single sign-on integration guides. Yeah, that's about it.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That's everything from us today. So we will be having another Apex office hours in 2 weeks, and we look forward to speaking to you again then.
All right, thanks everyone.